Okay, so maybe let's start our panel about enterprise Rails. Please meet the expert, Nathan
Hello,
from Eventit, Andrzej from Rails Event Store, and Nick from Trailblazer. Yeah. So, there are a few questions. You can still add more questions to the guest, so I will try to ask them. The first question is, what are the worst things that can happen in enterprise Rails kind of projects, and how to protect from them?
I mean, you're the expert, right? You running a company.
So the worst thing that can happen is that you no longer earn money, and that's a result of not being able to maintain the system or keep it stable or keep it running. And so I think that by definition, enterprise Rails means something like when the application starts making money, as opposed to the startups, for example. And when you have complicated business processes and you need to maintain them in the longer run, usually you have more programmers in those systems. I think when you lose control over the code base, that's
the question is
problem.
what is enterprise Rails? I wonder. What's the definition of an enterprise Rails application? And do those words go hand in hand?
So I'm not sure if there's a precise definition, but I would say once your company has departments and stuff like that, and your application is heavily used, it doesn't mean that you need to have many users. It's just people are using it, and it's your organization becomes more structured around it.
So
it might be successful applications, but I think when Rails started at the beginning, and there was this big thing in the community that we are anti-enterprise. That was what DHH was always saying.
That was basically trying to be punk, but he chose the
the
wrong word because enterprise software. I looked it up on Wikipedia actually to prepare for this panel, and Wikipedia is a web page on the internet. I don't know if you know it, and enterprise software means it's a software for more than one person. That's literally what it says on Wikipedia in the intro.
You know anybody can edit Wikipedia, right?
But it's democracy. Hello, you're from America. You probably don't.
Yeah, democracy is working great in America.
It's good that Poland is between.
Why do you think? Why do you think I got out and came here? I'll say the worst thing that can happen if you're doing Rails and also enterprise software is Active Record.
That's a good point. What's Active Record?
Oh,
I wonder.
What isn't Active Record? I think is a better question.
Yeah. So I think the general question we are addressing is enterprise Rails means you're using Rails in a professional environment. You want to have software that is maintainable, running, that is fun to work with. I mean, I'm enjoying my job. I'm sorry, and the problem is that certain frameworks, I'm not saying any names here right now, are kind of hard to deal with after a certain amount of complexity is added. And Active Record, for example, is a good word because it's not making it simple to add features without breaking other stuff.
Yeah, specifically, I think when you don't partition your system and you arrive at the kind of complexity that is always there in enterprise systems, if you haven't partitioned and everything's in one giant place and one giant universe, then everything slows down. It becomes hard to make changes, becomes hard to understand what's going on, to read the code. When you want to make a change in one place, you have to go make corresponding changes everywhere. You have to do data migrations and data cleanup.
Which is actually not what, I mean, enterprise, in my understanding, is, besides the Wikipedia definition, is I build a system that is maintainable, yeah? And so I'm struggling with a Rails Railsway system and maintainability in the same context, because it's really hard to maintain a Rails system. No offense.
Once it gets once it gets big.
Once it gets complex, but that's I mean, enterprise means you are successful. That means you have more than one page showing a coffee shop in.
You have more than
Brooklyn.
100 active records.
And you have more.
100, that's nothing, man. I've seen 700.
Yeah. So what I was, I mean, I think the panel is about there is enterprise Rails applications. I mean, there's lots of applications that make a lot of money and that have lots of users. The point is, where are we? Or I'm asking that to the experts from Poland and America. I'm asking, where are we in the Rails community? Like, because I mean, let's ignore that we were rejecting enterprise and all this stuff. I mean, we are all writing enterprise software. Hey, everyone here is writing enterprise software, right? Because you write software for more than one person.
There are some Elixir developers here.
Oh yeah, really?
Oh.
It's like functional stuff, right? Is it enterprise actually?
Anyway, I think it's a good start of the discussion. Like, where are we right now as a community? And I think the idea behind this panel was also to bring together people who are responsible for some of the tooling around this as well. Because I think Trailblazer is already here in the community for quite a while. I think it's popular because you are popular. I'm kind of responsible for Rails Event Store.
5 minutes ago he said, I smell.
He does.
That was 3 beers ago. And Nathan is responsible for Eventide.
Yes.
Which is used in a Trailblazer project, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Let's talk later.
You didn't know?
You never told me.
Because you never
forgot
called me.
He forgot. He even came to my hometown and didn't even call me or hit me up on Twitter.
Yeah, that's the Ruby community. You know, like you meet people and you forget about them.
It's not how I work, man. I have feelings.
It's good that we talk about it in front
personal
of
stuff
200
here.
people.
I think we got to the point where we have tooling. I think that was my point.
Yes.
Tooling.
And I think that the tooling,
T-double-O.
I think the tooling is getting more and more stable. So it's not only that Rails is stable and mature and so on, but also the tooling for, I don't know, the higher level architectures or some additional stuff, however we want to call what we do. And for example, with Rails Event Store, it was a long time we were discussing whether we should do something about Rails Event Store, whether such tools should exist. Then we decided it's a good idea, and things started to happen around this. We have now some GitHub repository, some gems around it. Trailblazer is very active. Eventide is also super interesting in terms of event-driven approaches. So I think we got to the point where now people experiment with those tools, right? How many of you experimented with at least one of the tools here? Yeah, so there's, I don't know, half a room. So that's good to hear, and probably there's still some things that don't work and can be fixed, especially with Trailblazer. But but it would be nice.
Taking no offense.
It would be nice to get some questions around it, like when would you like to introduce such tooling in your code base? Because the alternative is also go without such tooling. Maybe you prefer to build your own or build some other structure.
But I think the I don't know if it's a problem, but what we have right now is like there's some companies using the pure Rails way. Let's don't discuss this. Then there are lots of companies who building their own like tooling, and then there is companies using tools that we have like Rails Event Store, Eventide, Trailblazer, all this kind of stuff, Dry, RB. And I think enterprise means that you use tools that are available. I mean, I'm just looking at Java or something, and like they have tools for everything, and they are kind of standard. And I think enterprise means, that's my understanding, you use existing tools instead of rebuilding everything all the time. So I mean, your question aims at that, but this is my interpretation of how we get Ruby to a next level is to use or reuse tools that are there instead of because the most companies just rebuild stuff, like half-assed, pardon my French, and they rebuild stuff we have, and so we kind of lose the idea of what is a pattern, what is a good abstraction, what is an interface for this and that pattern, because we always build, I got a service object, I got view objects, I got form objects, but they all have different APIs. So I think enterprise would mean we use a standardized form object, for example. So And the problem is that Ruby is, I'm saying it's a problem, it's not a problem. The thing is that Ruby allows you to do things in 100 different ways, and we do it. So there's no standards, basically.
So,
which is why you have to ask who's using Eventide, for example.
Yeah, I think there's another point here too, which is these enterprise systems. If you think about a bank or a healthcare company, what you find is that it's very, very irregular or abnormal for one of these large-scale systems to be doing everything in a web request response context. But when we start a company and we build a web app with Rails, we're kind of putting everything in this web request response cycle. And I think that there's a transition that happens when you stop looking at your work as web development and you start looking at it as software development with some web sometimes for the front end. And I think that if we want to have Ruby be a vibrant community for all kinds of software development, then I think that we have to sort of wean ourselves off of this fixation on the web and start focusing on software in a more general fashion.
Very true.
Nice. So there's one question I think which is close to this discussion right now. Like Rails by default comes with MVC, right? Is it enough for successful enterprise app or not enough?
I would say it's not enough, and it was always a lie about the MVC pattern. It was never true MVC pattern on the backend. And I would agree with what you said. It's one of the definitions of enterprise. I would say it's like it's not only a web application anymore. And can you decouple your Rails layer from your application? Can you use your application like outside of the web environment? And I think, like for example, with Rails Event Store, that's kind of the goal, to help you separate your application from Rails.
Which is why it's called Rails Event Store, right?
Because it's optimized for Rails.
When you move it from single web application to like full system with multiple parts running independently from single Rails core application, then you're talking about something bigger than just application. Then this is like kind of enterprise, not single web application, but the whole system together.
What do you mean, like with some microservices, or?
Well, I mean, this is again buzzword which people don't like it. Like, so I would not talk about microservices. I'm talking about like independent parts, not only having one application, one monolith.
So maybe
stepping from monolith to something more, which is needed by requirements of your company, of your business. Then you're going to be enterprise, not like just startup who have like simple small product, which is in the MVP. When you're stopping having like MVP and you're going to have like something which is running and serving customer needs, more complex way, then you just like stopping getting funding, you are independent, then you are enterprise, matter of fact. Not like if you have WebPoint or not, but this is like about when your company stop to be like startup, having small MVP, and now you are running, you have more complex requirements, more clients, more use cases, then you are in the enterprise, in my opinion.
So but you're not saying that, I mean, using different languages or something for the different components in the environment doesn't say anything about the.
Yeah. One language or more.
Okay. No, I mean, from a generic point of view, the more you split your, I mean, I'm not saying, hey, let's have 500 microservices because it sucks, but I think the more you split your application into different parts, the more enterprise you are, because it means you are thinking about architecture, interfaces, what is going where, who shouldn't be knowing about responsibilities. And
Can I be the first person to say bounded context?
Is that from DDD?
Yeah.
So considering enterprise projects are big, does it require application to be distributed, or does Majestic Monolith is still reasonable?
According to DHH, sorry.
Yes or no?
People are waiting for a quote.
It's very hard. It's very difficult
Nathan.
to grow a complex software system in a single process boundary. And the minute that you introduce process boundaries, whether it's threads or Unix-style operating system processes or independent Docker containers or microservices, whatever your physical topology is, you're going to encounter distributed systems problems, and you're going to need to be ready for them. So there's no way around it. I would love to not have to worry about things like idempotence and concurrency, but they have to be understood. And the best that we can do is provide tooling that gives people the right controls to be able to implement safe and robust distributed systems that always work and work just as well as a simple FizzBuzz program in one script. I'm afraid to say I'm not talking about Elixir. And in fact, I would challenge you to say if you need something like Elixir to achieve robust distributed systems, then you're not actually understanding how distributed systems work. You're following patterns for an ecosystem that was designed for distributed systems. And one of the things that we want for Eventide is we never want to turn Eventide into the rails for distributed messaging or distributed systems, because then people won't understand how the fundamental physics underneath works, and it will always bite them. So I think, in fact, we can't look to tools to solve distributed systems problems for us. We can look to them to help us.
Eventide makes distributed systems easier, basically, right? By design.
It doesn't allow somebody who's incapable of building distributed systems that are robust able to do so. It is the tooling that someone who is already in possession of that knowledge, it will help them and save them some time from having to do it themselves.
So it's kind of a built-in idiot-proof mechanism.
It is actually not. I can think of 1,001 ways to use Eventide to build a terrible system that doesn't work.
But I mean that comes automatically with any tool, basically. Like
of course,
you can use Rails in a great way or in a bad way.
But the software development world's proclivity towards solutions that try to take the hard problems away from them is something that I think we have to push back against all the time, because we all have a tendency to succumb to magic silver bullets, and I just don't think that I want to be responsible for releasing a project that leads people to think that they've got a silver bullet that they can use to shoot themselves in the foot.
But I mean, Eventide encouraged people to build more stable software, I guess. Like that's your goal. I mean,
the authors of Eventide do, yeah.
So otherwise you wouldn't be building it, right? Like you want to make people, empower people to have the tools to build more stable, more maintainable software.
But we don't. Yeah. But when we do so, we don't teach people Eventide. We use it as a teaching tool in workshops and whatnot. But we teach people how to deliver a message from point A to point B such that it is processed once, for instance. And yes, Eventide is tooling that helps you do that. But the important thing is the knowledge that goes into how to analyze your system and translate it into bounded context and how to communicate across those contexts safely.
I think it's worth having a look at Eventide if you haven't. I think it's relatively not that popular overall, but it's very interesting. Even though we may have different opinions, like when to go microservices and when not to go there, I think the overall trend will sooner or later force us to go distributed. And then you will have problems like how to deliver one message from one place to another place and deliver it once or execute process it once. There's many interesting things, and the nice thing about Eventide, as I understand it, is that it's a good foundation for starting doing this.
But is this a Ruby problem, the delivering messages, or is it a problem in engineering in general?
It's the infrastructure, I would say.
No, I mean there are languages, I don't know, like Callbar is not a language, but like the mechanism was invented like 30 years ago, maybe not 30 years, but like messaging, for example, like Callbar, you call a method on a different object that might be a different language and a different ecosystem, and so those mechanisms exist, like I'm just wondering, is that a Ruby problem that we have?
We use Ruby. We use Ruby because we love Ruby, and we haven't switched to a new language because we still love
Another
Ruby.
Applause.
but I think just like distributed messaging is a problem that's decades old. So is we used to I wasn't involved in software when it was called this, but what we call microservices now, what used to be service-oriented architecture, used to just be called partitioning. And partitioning has been around for decades as well. And these ideas aren't new. And I would actually suggest that it's the constant changing of these technology fads that leads us to never really delve deep into these concepts, and we constantly reinvent them and give them new names to make them popular. But it's as if the software development world doesn't make progress because we change things at the surface, like switching Ruby for Elixir, for instance. And And that's
you
kind of
know,
my take
Elixir
on it.
comes with a built-in
Yeah, it comes in with it.
messaging, basically. So
It ships. Erlang ships with an actor model. That solves certain kinds of problems very
also
well.
with like, you know, processes, like you can detach a process, which is basically like a thread or a guild in Ruby 2.3 point something or whatever, 5.0. And you know, you have this messaging built in basically in the language. So sometimes I'm wondering, maybe is Ruby like blocking us from using distributed models? Because I mean, as you say, like it will end up, software has to be distributed, software has to be partitioned. Beautiful word, I've never used it before. Software has to be like in small components. That's like, there's no way around this. You don't want to have one big application, you change one thing and you break 5 other things. But I'm wondering, is Ruby, sometimes I wonder, is Ruby the problem? Like, is it maybe other languages, do they make it better? I'm lacking the experience.
I would say that it's not like problem only with one language. I mean, if you would take Elixir, Elixir is perfect when you're making your software process oriented. You need to optimize whole construction of the system to be process oriented. It's not universal language. This is the problem of Elixir as well. Right?
Yeah,
if you're looking for more general purpose language, which is giving you more options, if you will look for example on Clojure, you can choose transactional memory, processes, or threads. It's up to you. So it's not about the language again, in my opinion. So
Yeah.
Elixir is good only in the process-oriented stuff, in messaging, but other stuff will be block you. Like many use cases will be more difficult to make it in Elixir because of such architecture.
Okay, that's good, because I'm literally lacking experience with other languages. I've been doing Ruby for like 100 years, because Ruby was like invented 100 years ago.
I will say, you know, if you work in multi-threaded software or real-time systems where you have semaphores and mutexes, concurrent or parallel programming or parallel computing is always very difficult. And in fact, the vast majority of programmers never reach a stage where they're comfortable operating in highly parallel environments with lots of different asynchronous processes communicating. And I think one of the things we did with Eventide is, and actually it's not something we invented with Eventide. Following the patterns of event sourcing, we found a means by which we can build these independent autonomous services using patterns that we can teach to everyday programmers. And I think that's probably the most important thing blocking the software development world from, as you say, taking on distributed computing more.
And I think even sourcing is a key point in this transition.
Because it encourages encapsulation, right? I mean, you have different systems talking via events, not via like method calls or something like that.
Event sourcing precisely means building the state out of events. So that's like different ways of dealing with persistence. But then once you have event sourcing, everything else like comes for free. Like you can decouple the bounded context or whatever way you want to call them. You can go distributed because now you are like fully event driven. And I think this is like one of the steps in the bigger, like longer term transition, that you can start with a monolith and then decouple your modules and communicate between those modules using events. And once you have the events, you can then event source everything in this application.
So the event sourcing gives you a language to.
Yeah, so event sourcing is, you know, instead of what we are doing with Active Record is we are always keeping the data in the last state. We don't keep them the history. We can't rebuild it from the beginning. And with some applications that usually was okay. That's how Rails is doing the stuff. This is how CRUDs are working. But for bigger systems, you know, going events seems to be like more and more accepted and probably required. And if you need to go distributed at some point, it's also hard to imagine any other protocol than messages. So if you have it built in the monolith, it will be easier for you to go into distributed way. And I think we are also like, look at how languages didn't change that much over the last 10 years, for example. But also look how the way we deploy our Rails applications did change over those last 10 years. So how we struggled 10 years ago with restarting the Rails application because it was leaking and we are all dealing with our servers and so on. And the tooling kept changing. It was like Passenger, Puma, and Now probably many of
Web
people
rig.
here are using some kind of Heroku or some other clouds. The big companies like Amazon, they are investing huge money in their platforms. Will probably all end up in their ecosystems. They are investing huge money in serverless. That's like important keyword to follow for the next 10 years probably. And serverless is based on events.
I would say there's a problem with
You should have your own chair and your own microphone.
there is
in my
This gentleman
opinion.
a chair.
sorry.
We gave you a separate slot for a talk.
No problem. So like there is problem with serverless as well, because like when you take a look on the serverless, you have events. This is true, but mostly low level about resources in the serverless architecture. You know that some file was uploaded, some states is
No,
changed,
that's-
but not
it's-
about the
it's-
business low
It's
level.
up to you. It's up to you. You
But
can
it's
have
But
like,
that's something
customer
I wanted
bought
to ask
something.
in general is sorry if I interrupt your
Sure.
statement, but so Eventide and Rails Event Store is both event what's it called, the CQ, no, not CQRS.
So Rails Event Store is DDD, event sourcing, and CQRS.
So
We support those
Eventide
six.
is also event sourcing, right?
Eventide supports
And
more.
what I was wondering, and I wanted to ask you guys that actually, like, I actually wanted to ask you that is, so event sourcing is not, so lots of people think of event sourcing as like a historical database, like you can restore something, but I think that's not the key of event sourcing, right? The key is like you say, like designing events that define the system behavior, basically, right?
Yeah.
Or am I wrong? It is like,
With definition, I think event-driven architectures is when you react to those events. Event sourcing means only that you're building from those
but
events.
event sourcing is only a side effect of the design around events, right?
Yeah, that's a natural consequence.
Because
at some
because
point.
many people say like, oh, we need a historical database, let's use event sourcing, and that's not my understanding of event sourcing. Event sourcing for me means I don't think in active record calls, I think in like business domain concerns and what might happen when and how they communicate, which is kind of like what I think you were talking about the same, like when you said
Yep.
it's low level events, you meant like we have to talk more about like business events, like what's-
Exactly. Focus on the like one thing which you mentioned again about bounded context is one important fact. When you like there was like few comparisons about like when you're using bounded context properly in your domain-driven application, it's much easier to slice it later on by the borders of the bounded context to be like microservice, and then the messaging layer is let you like connect them together like in asynchronic way. But this again, you cannot. I mean, you theoretically you can like send events and publish them over the all bounded context. But I would say this is also not the best way, because then information about current implementation of event is also leaking out. So I would also isolate somehow by anti-corruption layers between different services and so on. But like I said, bounded context is a perfect candidate to think about microservice. Of course, only if you're keeping own state
And
inside.
I agree, and this is where the ideas connect. Like being event sourced, event driven doesn't mean you have to go DDD, but it's a really nice combination of things.
Yeah, I think we've missed two huge benefits of event sourcing. The first one's around when we talk about distributed systems. One of the most important things to understand when you especially if you come from Rails. So in Rails you have this notion of these models that are your nouns, and they're your state.
database tables, basically.
Yeah, and you've also got background jobs. When you need to move some code outside of your request response cycle, you put it in a background job. Well, let's talk about background jobs for a second. If our active record model is a bank account, and our background job is transferring funds from one account to another, we can, if we move to event sourcing or an event sourcing paradigm, we can actually model both of these as event sourced entities. We can have long-running business objects like a bank account or an order, or we can have these short-term temporal processes like moving money from A to B. And those short-term processes can actually coordinate activity with other systems. And that's how we can build distributed systems out of event sourcing that work really well. And the other benefit that I think we've missed is as an information architecture, you can think of events as being like a stem cell, in the sense that they're undifferentiated, they're unopinionated about what they mean. They just reflect what occurred. And when you think about all of the events from a data perspective, when you think about all the events that have been written, you can now transform them into any other kind of representation. This is why when people get excited about event sourcing, they get excited about being able to produce new reports that include historical data, that's an application of the fundamental truth, which is that events are the rawest, most usable form of data that you can store. And if you look at your data and your information as an asset, then event sourcing maximizes the value of that asset.
But the historical part is only a side effect of event sourcing, right?
Right.
Like
But
event
it's,
sourcing
well,
wasn't
I
invented.
actually want to take that back.
It's a great side effect, but it's like because people always.
Whether or not you disposition as a side effect probably depends on what your priorities are.
But event sourcing wasn't invented to replay something. Event sourcing. And I have no idea what I'm talking about. Like event sourcing, in my understanding.
Well, this will be
why I'm
fun
sitting
then.
here, by
This
the
will be
way.
really fun then.
If you're an expert, you don't have a chair. You just sit somewhere in the audience and get your own microphone. So, event sourcing was event sourcing was built around like designing a system with bounded contexts and communicating via events, right? And then the historical database thing is only that's something that comes automatically, basically, right? Yeah, which is because that's another thing I always like wonder about is like we have event sourcing, then we have event driven design or something like that, then DDD, which uses events but not event sourcing, right? So maybe I'm genuinely interested.
It hurts my.
There is even idea of command sourcing. Some people trying
CQRS or what's it called?
commander approach, right?
So-
When you're also storing information about all commands, not only about events, but then you're dealing problem with side effects and how to treat
Where's your microphone?
So someone asked whether it's possible to combine Trailblazer with event sourcing and CQRS, but then you don't have to answer that.
You would have to read some books.
It's answered. It's answered in my talk. No. But I mean, can we clarify that? Because I'm really genuinely interested in event sourcing. I love the idea of the communicating components and this kind of stuff, like historical events, not like let's change state and just change it like the way Active Record does it. But I never understood what's.
So
like
does Trailblazer use events somehow?
yeah, so in
if-
Trailblazer 2.1, you're going to see it in my talk, unless you're going to the pub or something in 10 minutes. We kind of apply BPMN conventions to like the way we model processes, and BPMN has events, and events are the same events that you have in event sourcing. I don't know what's the appropriate word. That's my problem.
Yeah, that's more enterprise than I'm willing to go.
Which is why I'm wearing a suit and a tie.
Yeah.
No, but that's I mean, for me it would be helpful if I know like Eventide. Let's take Eventide. What patterns does it bring, and what's the architectural idea behind it?
Well, do we have about an hour or 2 hours or?
We will have a talk by Nathan later.
I mean, there are over 30 libraries that make up Eventide. So I think if
But the general idea is
the general idea is it's a collection of libraries that are useful to anybody who wants to implement systems with event sourcing and or
event
microservices.
sourcing. And event sourcing
Yeah,
is
so event sourcing plus microservices optional part. Rails Event Store is like event sourcing, DDD, and CQRS, but without the microservices part.
And now he's blaming me for not knowing all those abbreviations and patterns and. Okay, so event sourcing.
Just read some books.
Yeah. Like I have so much time. Like I only like maintain 39 gems. Like I have totally time to read books. I actually read books, but they are novels.
Okay, so do you think that enterprise libraries like yours should be paid libraries or free?
Would you like to be paid for Trailblazer?
I am.
Oh, that's cool. But directly, like if someone wants to use Trailblazer and you give him some more features.
Well, we have paid gems coming up very soon, so we
Cool.
kind of. I mean, it's still open source, but it's paid because it makes sense, and lots of companies want to throw money at us to say, "Hey, let's." Here you go. Which is why I can afford very expensive apparel.
I don't know. I kind of think walled gardens usually die. I think it's very hard to build an enthusiastic community around proprietary products. And of course, I would love to make a fortune off of the work that I've done. But at the same time, my colleague and I, we started with Eventide. It didn't have a name. We were solving problems that we had, and there was tooling that was not available. And our mission is really centered around making sure when other people find, when other people are in that same position, that they have tooling available to them. And I think that's more important than personal profit.
Yeah. Looking on all your solutions that you're proposing here, to be honest, you have options because you also have in the mind not only one use case. When I'm looking on Rails Event Store, Eventide, or Trailblazer, you are not supporting only one use case and taking care only about one use case. Raceway, as a matter of fact, is based on the one use case of the base guy. Everything else is just side effect. When you're doing your libraries, you need to think, because for example, you have agency. We need to think about different requirements, not only single use case of Basecamp. That's why your systems are more open to be used and extended in a better way than just Raceway, because you're not really thinking only
Thank you.
one use case.
So with Rails Event Store, the most inspiration comes from our client projects, and Rails Event Store is mostly funded and supported by RKNC. So it is it's similarly as in Basecamp, as it's more than one project. So we usually have 5 projects at one time, and we try to introduce Rails Event Store and use some event-driven approaches, and we see what is important, what's helpful. That's how we introduce some pattern support one by one. At the beginning, we've had aggregates. Recently, we've got a really nice addition of process managers, because now we support the idea of having events in many streams. And this was always needed in our projects. So immediately, once we had support for process managers, it was immediately much easier in our clients' projects to use process managers. And this is one of really beautiful patterns in the domain-driven design community, but also in general, the idea of sagas or of process managers.
Hi. So what I find very difficult and where I sense some conflict in the board is really, when it comes to domain-driven design, it is actually a mouthful in order to learn about the difference of event storming, event sourcing, CQRS, etc. What an aggregate is, what a command is.
I'm the only person in the board who doesn't know this.
Exactly, and I think it's fair enough, and we should not sit here and assume that everybody in the room has this kind of knowledge. So having a better understanding, maybe we should have introduced Trailblazer, Eventide, Rails Event Store previously, and have the discussion afterwards. I think
we'll have the extension with the later talks now. So
yeah, so just really thinking about how can we have a better discussion around that. What I think what you're doing great is championing sort of exploration of domains and going back to design, because in the world today we are presented with tools which make us very fast at developing features, right? And you can do everything with Strut, with React, whatsoever, and you're super fast, but you don't spend time on modeling the domains anymore. And the expectation of this, I love the sentence yesterday, build me a table with 2 buttons. This is how features are developed, and I think the championing approach that you take to communicate how do we model design our systems and form a new language to explore best practices, this is something I really appreciate and where I want to thank you for. Cool,
thanks.
Sometimes open source developers need compliments.
And hacks.
Sometimes. And sometimes open source developers need constructive criticism as well.
But do you get that automatically? Come on, I don't want to know how many fights you had over Eventide versus Railsway and this kind of stuff.
I can comment on your code if you want.
You're always welcome. If you ever want to air it out, I'm game.
Can I ask one question? Do you imagine someone using parts of your ecosystems in one project? What would you say would be the part of Eventide you would like to use in a project with Rails Event Store, or the other way around? So, can you imagine ways to incorporate parts of these systems in one application?
I was wondering the same, but I didn't dare to ask because it would tell them that I don't know their gems inside out.
I would like we are inspired at Rails Event Store. We are inspired by Eventide, with the way they went distributed from the beginning. Rails Event Store is for monolithic Rails applications right now. We are working on the support for distributed systems and to send messages reliably over the network. It's still in progress, and we are under big influence here.
So Eventide is more low level in a way, or what's it? Where is the overlap basically?
Well, I think in terms of, so I think I would wager that probably the things that you can do in Rails Event Store overlap very strongly with the things that you can do in Eventide. Trailblazer, on the other hand, I look at Trailblazer as, and you can correct me because I'm in ignorance because I haven't personally used it on one of my projects, but it looks like a front-end framework for building the web side or the user interface side, with cells and some of the other features. So I can imagine employing Trailblazer more likely than Rails Event Store simply because of the strong overlap with what these two projects do.
So both gems or projects implement event sourcing. Is that the right word?
I think we probably went more into this DDD area where Eventide didn't go.
So Eventide, but Eventide I understand as a low level framework for event sourcing, like the pattern basically, right? And you can message, send events to other participants, and this will run a process automatically defined by Eventide, right? This is kind of how it works. I mean, I looked at it on GitHub, which is pretty cool. The README is good, and also your website, man.
That's not me. That's Scott. He's got an eye for that
what's
kind of
his
detail.
email address?
It's widely published, I think. Yeah, you can hit him up on Twitter, but he does. And actually, I think if I'm at the risk of divulging too much, I believe it might be Squarespace, which is apparently a pretty nice tool for building websites. So I don't want to. I want to avoid the term low level because I think that it connotes sort of operating system or complex machinery. I think it's Eventide is web agnostic.
Which is what I mean with low level in terms of not connected to any framework. Trailblazer is also not connected to any framework, so it's kind of low level, but it's defining a high level architecture. I know it doesn't make sense, but you know what I mean. Rails Event Store by name is bound to Rails and implements certain patterns and behavior and events and naming, and I think they overlap with the idea in Eventide, obviously. But I'm just wondering, I've seen Eventide in other projects, not in Rails, for example.
Yeah.
So how hard would it be to use Rails Event Store in?
So Rails Event Store is just a thin layer on top of Ruby Event Store.
Okay.
Ruby Event Store is a collection of libraries also, and you can use it in Hanami or wherever you want. So there is no coupling to Rails. And the Rails layer above this is only to make it more
Rails
convenient for what Rails developers would expect. So there is some kind of a nicer API, some nicer conventions at the Rails Event Store level. And Ruby Event Store is more generic, and you can use it totally without Rails.
Generic was the word, not low level, sorry.
Yeah.
Generic is much better. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the Eventide experience, there's no web in it anywhere, which means when you're using it in the context of a web server or web framework, it doesn't interfere because how could a web framework interfere with generic? Actually, it's actually proven. Rails has proven time and again that it can and will interfere with code outside of Rails.
Don't start this discussion, please. We will be here in 5 hours fighting. Blood will be shed.
So just to add some vision around Rails Event Store also, we started with the idea that it should be easy to bring Rails Event Store into an existing Rails project.
That makes sense.
And gradually, make it more event-driven. Now we got to the point where this is already done. This is where we can introduce Rails Event Store in the Rails project and everything just works. And now we want to focus more on the idea of starting new projects, also Rails projects, but doesn't have to be Rails. And from the beginning, rely on Rails Event Store. Sort of being event-driven from the beginning, being event source from the beginning. I think here we are on the same page. I really want to support the idea of event sourcing almost fully. And that's where we want to go with Rails Event Store in the next steps.
So basically, when you use an event sourcing gem, may it be Rails Event Store or Eventide, so basically the controller actions, I'm speaking in novice speak now, the controller actions change from doing something specific to like throwing an event, or how is the workflow basically?
Typically, when I'm in
a controller action was a metaphor for like a user action.
Yeah, it's a little bit subtle to explain, but yeah, when you're thinking about like a web controller that's handling a request, in the systems that we build with Eventide, even if we were to use Eventide without microservices, we would probably be getting out of that request response cycle very quickly. For instance, we would issue a command message, and some consumer might pick up that command message and carry out the instruction. So I don't know if that answers your question, but does it answer your question?
Hey, that's a meta question. That's so nerdy.
Yeah.
Because one of my clients, they are using Eventide with Trailblazer, which is like absolutely not overlapping. So basically what they do is the controller, so user action, triggers events, and those get transported by Eventide, and then the actual business logic happening after that is Trailblazer. And
Yeah,
Trailblazer
actually,
again
this is familiar to me now.
triggers. I think they hired you like a couple of weeks ago. They told me.
Yeah,
This is all
yeah.
confidential stuff. Don't tell anyone.
Yeah, and sorry, we're consultants, and that this kind of discussion happens. Yeah, wipe edit. Yeah,
And if you buy it now, you can save up to.
Right, and that particular organization, I do look forward to hearing reports from them about what the experience was like with Trailblazer and Eventide.
Well, they are. I can tell you the response. I mean, they are moving towards like they have a really complex system, and they are moving towards event sourcing.
Yeah,
and they chose Eventide. I think they didn't know about Rails Event Store because they started to talk about Eventide from the day one, and then so that's kind of their go-to architecture. They use Eventide domain speak. They model their everything is around domains and events. I think that's called DDD or something. And then as the underlying low-level business logic framework, they use Trailblazer because they like work. There's no overlap, you know. Like we have events, but we don't.
I'm
know
totally okay with advertising Eventide, even though there is like some overlap, because I'm not here to sell you Rails Event Store, but I'm here to sell you the idea of being event-driven and event-sourced. And I don't care if you use Rails Event Store or Eventide for that.
Is there any chance?
and I'm finding that I'm also very comfortable with y'all promoting Eventide, actually.
Actually,
Okay.
so I've heard it's pretty shit. Like,
I'm not a good salesman.
Okay, so I think that we need to.
I agree with that sentiment. Too.
Finish.
Sorry to interrupt. I do
Okay.
agree with that sentiment. I think getting people to explore and then invest in new architectural styles that go beyond Rails is something that benefits everybody, and that's why.
and this is basically also the finishing line, the closing remark for this. I mean, for this panel, because in the end of the day, you want to build stable, mature software that's maintainable enterprise, and I think those kind of concepts we discussed is where we should be heading.
Those ideas are already in other communities, so it's not like we are inventing something new here.
Ruby is always 15 years behind.
Java,
but that's-
.NET, even PHP is very, very far also. So it's just catching up, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.